Welcome, everybody. This session, we're talking about accelerating tomorrow's climate finance leaders. My name is Stefan Peters. I'm the Managing Director of the International Climate Finance Accelerator, or we like to call it the ICFA. In this session, we wanted to give you an overview of our program, our initiative, and how we actually accelerate the various climate fund managers we have in the program, as well as give you a little bit of a tasting of the fund managers that we've accelerated and are currently still supporting in our program. So, if anybody has had a chance to actually see their environment around here, we're looking at this amazing kind of hall, which is steeped in history, and I think many people have probably already said it. It really carries a little bit of symbolism that we're actually talking about our future right now, instead of really just only the history. So the goal of this session is really to give you an idea about how we can transform the various ideas, discussions that we've been having over the last couple of days into concrete climate action. So how do we actually get these pledges, all this money and capital that has actually been kind of put in the headlines, how does that flow and how does that actually get to the beneficiaries, get to the people who need it the most, really? So we'll be talking with a couple of the fund managers here. We've got one of our fund managers here in person, and the rest are going to be, like you, many of you, digitally here. So let me first dive into the ICFA itself. So the ICFA was an initiative created in 2018 by the Ministry of Finance in Luxembourg, as well as the Ministry of Environment. They were joined by 10 private parties. You can see quite some big names here, the Big Four, two of our leading law firms in Luxembourg, as various other players in the financial markets and the impact system in Luxembourg itself. We also have the support of the European Investment Bank, where we can leverage their expertise and support as well. The ICFA sits in the greater climate finance strategy of the Luxembourg government. We have a variety of other initiatives as well. We sit more on the innovation side of things. And what we're really targeting here is targeting a market need. A lot of the fund managers that we see out there, they're struggling to really get their projects launched. It's a heavy investment. There's a lot of barriers. There's a lot of upfront investment in time, but also capital to really get a fund up and running. And we're getting a lot of support and a lot of questions coming from the market there who are looking for this type of support. And as you saw from the previous page, we're a true public-private partnership. The investment that goes directly to accelerating and catalyzing these fund managers. So our mission really is to use climate finance to build a better world, in short. So what we do is not only kind of create the new future leaders on climate finance, we also make sure that they set up more vehicles and they create pathways to actually have these pledges flow through the funds and get more assets under management to deploy. Now, obviously, Luxembourg is very well known as a financial center, so we do want to incite them to base themselves in Luxembourg, but we also want to make sure that our ecosystem kind of can provide and become a center of excellence on climate finance specifically. So who are the people that we're targeting? So we're looking at fund managers who are looking for their first or second time fund, who are looking to scale innovative, high-impact climate solutions themselves, and ultimately have a very developed and tested investment strategy, where we're talking about the key areas to address climate action. Ultimately, we'd like them to set up in Luxembourg, but this is really much more dependent on their own needs than really our requirement. What do we offer them? Well, we offer them financial leverage by giving them supporting loans, which I'll talk a little bit further on later on. We give them visibility, like events like this. The ICFA program itself has a very rigorous selection process as well. So the fund managers that we allow into our cohorts will get a sort of seal of approval, seal of excellence. The ICFA brand actually stands for that and builds credibility for them as well. And finally, we have the fund managers of different cohorts working together, sharing knowledge, and providing peer-to-peer learning as well. So the community is definitely something that we want to kind of incite and bring further with them. So how does that actually work? Because concretely, what do they need? So we provide, first of all, a support service envelope where we, for each fund manager, they allow 80,000 euros to really kind of develop, set up, and launch their fund, as well as a working capital loan with a Luxembourgish bank with a state guarantee behind it of about 200,000. It's not only financial support, it's also non-financial support. We do a lot of training sessions to help them develop their funds, their projects, and kind of deepen their knowledge and address any of the gaps that we see in their proposals. We match them with an expert coach to make sure that they have a trusted, objective party to give them advice, to support them through the process of actually getting to a first close of their fund. And finally, we also provide office space for if they come to Luxembourg as a seat within Europe as a sort of base of operations. We've been running for 3 years so far. We've actually accelerated 4 cohorts in the past, and we've just announced our latest cohort as well, 2021. So in total, we have now 23 fund managers who've run through the process and have been benefiting from the program itself. The portfolio itself is actually fairly diverse. We have a fairly good geographic split internationally. The funds themselves deploy a variety of instruments, and we're very happy to say that we have almost half of them actually addressing climate adaptation, so not only just pure climate mitigation type of funds. So ultimately, we're looking to be a catalyzer. So with the modest investment that we've done, we see that they are now targeting to raise almost $1.4 billion assets under management, with also the effect that they're probably going to be mitigating almost 500 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So if you want to read more and have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from everybody. And if there are any questions at all right now, then also happy to field them. But let me then first introduce our first speaker, Joseph Zahar. He is the co-founder and CEO of Pandan Green, and they are trying to unlock private sector finance at scale for vulnerable communities in South and Southeast Asia, as well as the Pacific. Yoshi, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, ICFA, and thank you very much for the organizers of this event. I have to say that, to start with, that whatever I intended to say at the beginning when I came here 2 days ago is going to be a bit different than what I'm actually going to say today, because this event allowed me to learn quite a lot about how are we evolving, and I think there's a lot of insights that we will be taking forward to our activity. So, starting with that, okay, I think we may just move forward. Yeah. So how did it all started? 3 years back, out of a scoping work of United Nations in ASEAN countries in Asia Pacific, we tried to look at what barriers are there actually for climate finance arriving to the most vulnerable. Why is it that international climate finance is not making its way to the vulnerable communities and those that are most at need? And we came up with few, I would say, insights which relate to funds, international funds face barriers coming in, and B, of course, the local market is not ready to implement any significant climate finance activity with vulnerable communities. We then kind of chose to focus on rural communities, the most vulnerable, the most impacted from climate change, and we try to actually set up a facility or to think of an idea how to bring private sector finance into that area and actually bring the change which is required. Just about the vision, I mean, we really want to make a difference. I mean, we hear a lot of, there is a lot of talk, and there's a lot of good intentions, and there's a lot of good work, but our vision is really to make an incredible difference. We believe we can make a difference for Asia Pacific, we believe we can make a difference for the LDCs, for the seeds, by actually taking a new approach, by bringing finance to the most vulnerable, and developing the work with the communities, and actually developing a stream of finance which will grow and scale up to a very large amounts. And I will elaborate. And of course, our mission, we would like to do that through capital markets. We believe, everybody's been saying that capital markets are in fact, the debt capital markets are the answer. That's where the trillions are. And we do need the billions in those countries, and we need it now. So how do we do that? How do we bring capital markets into vulnerable communities? This is kind of the mission that we are actually undertaking. I'd just like to touch the ICFA winning last year. That for us it was a major event, and to illustrate how significant it is. Following that win, we had actually had an anchor investor commitment. Following that win, we had commitments from development partners. We created partnerships. So I think Stefan mentioned before the envelope and the financial support and all of these activities, but the most important part for us is the recognition by the Luxembourg green finance ecosystem that what we are doing is significant, and what we are doing will contribute to the environment. So therefore, I think that the role of ICFA is extremely important in developing new ideas that would actually make the change. Of course, this is all Paris Agreement aligned, and we are guided by it. So where are we exactly? I mean, if you see these these connections, so we are talking about scale, and scale could only come from our perspective, from financial institutions, local financial institutions on the ground in the countries of operations in Asia Pacific. So we need to be working with local financial institutions. International capital markets, I've already mentioned. We need to have international capital markets for the scale. And of course, capacity building. In order for us to actually make it happen, finance is one aspect, but we need to make it happen on the ground. We need to work with the communities first. We need to work with the financial institutions. We need to work with the governments. We need to work with various stakeholders, in fact, to make a difference. And the result is, of course, a triple bottom line that many are talking about. So environmental impacts. I mean, we are targeting a green, we are targeting a transition. We would like to see the environmental impact. We would like to see the communities strengthening. We would like to see sustainability. And we would like to achieve all of that within the timeline of our fund. And of course, high social impact. In fact, when we are talking about a transition, and that is what we are actually making, we do need to start with social. And a lot of these investments for vulnerable communities, at the first stage, we go to the social. So education, employment, especially now when actually recovering from the pandemic. And we cannot forget the institutional investors. We cannot forget the capital markets. We cannot forget, we need to make it viable. So we will be providing a vehicle that will meet the institutional, the key investors' requirements and fiduciary requirements. We are not going to provide a bond, a certain rating bond with less with what is needed in terms of return. We will be providing capital markets player with what they wish, with what they need. Just a bit about the scope. So Asia Pacific, we are going to actually target the islands, also the LDCs, the islands. We do not wish to go for the easy options or the only focus on the more developed Asian countries. We really want to reach to those countries where we actually see the greatest difficulties and the most vulnerable. And for that, of course, we need support in terms of blended finance instruments, and especially in terms of, I think first loss was mentioned, and that is something that we are currently working on. We are looking for partners. We're working with partners, with financial institutions. It's about people. It's about people in the communities, about leaders in the community, leaders for financial institutions. We cannot just go to financial institutions and say, hey, let's join this initiative and let's do our best. We want to have people that share the vision with us, owners, management of financial institutions. And what we do find on the ground with kind of a lot of work already, that there are many, many partners, local partners on the ground that are sharing the vision and understand and wish to move forward. And this is our capacity building approach. I mean, this tries to describe it. I mean, we start on the left with the communities. We need to identify, we need to work with the communities, identify their needs, develop the work with the communities, and identify not only the needs, and yesterday it was actually talked about, identify apart from the, I would say, the various things we will be measuring, what is the difference that the communities actually would want to get from this activity? And I think it was emphasized yesterday in the discussions. So we want to see, okay, what is it that makes the difference, not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of the community, of landscape? We want to touch these issues and not eventually come up with a metrics of a 5-year impact and saying, okay, that's great, but in fact, that's not what communities wanted. So working with the communities is key, so actually assisting them with the adaptation also of products, assisting them with the learning, with knowledge. And then we actually will be working with financial institutions. And I also would like to have a takeaway from this morning's session. I think Simon was mentioning that first, in order to invest in green products, or we need to invest in actually greening the financial system. So this is where we come, and we will be working with the financial institutions on having the transition within and the financial ecosystem. And once we do that, we can actually work with them in developing the products for the communities. And of course, governments, local and central, we must be working with governments. I mean, this is a private sector led, but we are supported on the blended finance from governments. We are supported by the Luxembourg government. We will be supported in the first loss, in guarantees. We also need to support it on the ground, work with the governments, work with the local communities, local governments, with central governments, work with existing subsidies to try to make it happen. And of course, capital markets. We need to actually prepare the local financial markets. We need to prepare external capital markets. We need to prepare them to work to accept funds from capital markets, and we need to prepare the investors to invest in vulnerable communities. And there is a lot of work there to be done. We must understand how this investment is going to be benefiting vulnerable communities. Investors or mainstream investors need to understand how to actually create that impact and how to actually not make harm. So all of these aspects, we need to do a lot of preparations, a lot of work in order to make an effective outcome. I think working together locally is key. I mean, we are not coming from out there and just saying, okay, let's do this and that. I mean, we need to work locally. We need to work with the various players to create partnerships. We do not know it all. We have created great partnerships locally in each of the countries, and of course externally for our fund level to actually support us in building the fund and support us on the capacity building. So I think collaboration, listen to local leaders, work with local partners, this is really essential and this is key, and without it, we cannot actually get the success. Just talking about landscapes and biodiversity, and maybe looking at that, no, I'll go back to this one. So it's very easy to focus only on solar panels and say, we work with vulnerable communities, we create a range of solar panels or other easy products, but no, we actually would like to tackle the hardest bits. We would like to tackle the agriculture value chain. We would like to tackle smart technologies, and we would like to develop them over time. So I've discussed about impact assessments, and this is what we have put together. We will be assessing and we'll be monitoring and we'll be put indicators However, one thing is missing here, and this is my takeaway from this event, and that is what is the population, what will be the population determining themselves, how will they be affected, and what will be the getting out of it. And we'll be making sure that this will go into our impact criteria, because I'm convinced, we are convinced that this is a very kind of a key thing for a success of any green transition process. And that's how it's going to look like. It's a 5-year facility. So if you see the red, the start is actually social, and then gradually the rest is various green transition products and elements. So this is a transition, and this takes time, and this is sustainability. So we start with social, and we will work together with the communities, with the various stakeholders, with the financial institutions, and gradually we will make the sustainable shift. Thank you very much for listening, and I really thank you again for hosting Panda and this really a great conference.
Thank you, Yoshi. If there's any questions in the audience to Yoshi, please stick up your hand now. We've got 2 there.
Hello. 2 questions. How do you source your projects, your investments, opportunities, and how much you pay for the project developers?
How do you use social?
How do you acquire those developed projects that generally has taken a lot of time and effort and expertise to build? Yeah. So what is how do you incorporate in your CapEx, or do you incorporate in your CapEx the development cost of the projects?
Sure. It's actually 2 separate elements. One is a fund, and the separate at the side is a capacity building element that incorporates the work on the project and on the products in the countries. Now, I think one distinction is that the component of the capacity building needs to be higher than it is now for any of other areas which I've seen. This is a transition, and that needs to be understood, and we need to invest a lot of money in this capacity building. So I think it's an excellent point, but we want to tackle it, because what is for investors is for investors. They cannot see other things coming in. But at the side, we will have a capacity building, a very, very strong capacity building element to make it happen. I hope that answers. Okay.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, one for you and one for the other gentleman. What we have seen in the financial market is a lot of conditions and difficulties in applying, in filling forms, and this and that. And the local communities who are vulnerable have no capacity to do that. In fact, what they want is finance immediately to do an activity. Yeah. So how do you manage that challenge so that at least there is a reduction of conditions for the communities to fill? That is one. Second is, would you consider helping or working in Africa as well, like in Asia? And the question I have is, because I do not understand your presentation, are you working with people to develop leaders, or you actually giving finance for people with a vision or with a mission to do things or activities that counter-check climate issues? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so first of all, we would love to do also in other regions, and maybe that is maybe next stage, because there's no reason why scalability or replicability cannot happen. And as to working with how to bring, it's true, the communities are not sophisticated. I mean, there's no sophistication in the financial system. But if we work with financial institutions, with local financial institutions, and we actually equip them with the knowledge, we equip them with the transition knowledge, we equip them with the green tools, then this could happen. So the key is local financial institutions, in our view, and that's our approach, in fact.
Yes, and so to your question on who we actually work with, we work with teams or individuals who have a background in project development, who would actually like to actually set up a fund on the side as well. So instead of only working on the ground through a variety of means, they would then also get a set of capital that they can deploy with into the communities that they're working. So it's very much like Yoshi's presentation as well, where they set up the fund to really work and augment the good work that they're already doing on the project development, on the various donations and the capacity building that they're doing on the ground, essentially. All right. One more question.
Thank you. Hello. One question is about how do you guys ensure the impact of the project you are funding? On which data, which tool? How do you ensure the neutrality of what you are monitoring? That's my question.
All right. I think that's for you.
Yeah, of course, each fund has its own strategy, but this question is something that I have to admit, we are struggling with every day. In fact, this is the #1 issue we are talking about. We do not want to come to the market with something which eventually will end up after a few years without any significant impact. And how to measure it, we want to approach it in a tech way, in a sophistication, the various ways to measure. But we are struggling with this point. And I have to say that also, I mean, we want to build the confidence with investors, with capital markets investors who are not used to work with vulnerable communities. And they're relying on us to showcase them how to do so. So we are actually hoping to work together with them and working together with them on defining how it should look like. Because there's a lot of on stake here, and we cannot risk anything. So, thank you.
And just to add on that, I mean, every fund manager will have to go through this process. They'll obviously draft their own impact policy, as well as the management of reporting systems that are part of that. But it is going to be very bespoke depending on what their strategy is, which geographies they work in, what the key targets are for them to actually measure it. So, thank you, Yoshi. Now, we want to go on to our next speaker, Alexander Koch, who's the founder and CEO of Natural Strategies Investments. Their Nature for Climate Fund invests globally in green commodities, sustainable food tech, and ecosystem restoration.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, IFCA colleagues. Very excited to be here today. I hope you can see and hear me all right, as I'm not on site, but only online. I take that as a yes.
Alexander, are you there?
Can you hear me? Stefan, can you hear me?
We seem to be having some technical difficulties here. We don't hear him, though.
Stefan, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. All right, Alexander,
okay.
Go ahead.
Apologies, there must have been a bit of an issue with the microphone. Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, IFCA colleagues. Really excited to be here today at this conference, even though I don't have the opportunity to be there in person, but at least I can exchange with you online. I'm going to switch into full screen mode so that you can see my presentation a little bit better. As you may know, we just entered the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. We all know that the stakes couldn't be higher. So how can we contribute to making this a success? This conference is about forests, food, and finance. So let's start there. How do these three link together? How can they help us in the fight against climate change? We know that 1.6 billion people around the world depend on forests for their daily livelihoods. In addition, we know that forest ecosystems are vital stabilizers for our global climate. Unfortunately, we also know that they're disappearing at an alarming rate. They're the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world, but among the most threatened ones. More than 12 million hectares are degraded year by year. The main factor that contributes to the loss of forests and biodiversity in these areas is actually very well understood. It is the conversion of forests to agricultural land. It is really just a handful of commodities, among them cocoa, coffee, timber, rubber, beef, and palm oil, that drive more than a quarter of this destruction. Unfortunately, the trends in this context are worrying. The global population is expected to grow from 7 billion people in 2010 to almost 10 billion people in 2050. And we know that with growing incomes, the demand for more resource-intensive food will only grow. Today, we already use half of the world's vegetated land for agriculture. So imagine what happens if we do not succeed to address this challenge very quickly. This would be set to get much worse. As I mentioned, a handful of food-related commodities drive more than a quarter of forest destruction around the world. The good news, or the flip side of this coin, if you want, is if some of all these communities can be produced more sustainably, the impacts on reducing deforestation and on mitigating climate change can be very powerful indeed. And this is exactly where Nature for Climate Fund will come in. The N4C Fund will seek to address the crisis that we're seeing by redirecting capital from current agricultural practices to more sustainable alternatives, to forest-friendly agricultural and forest practices, to practices that conserve and restore forests instead of converting them, instead of destroying them, and to practices that generate socioeconomic benefits for those local communities that live in and around these areas and who depend on healthy forests for their livelihoods day by day. So with our fund, our mission is to contribute to solving the climate and biodiversity crises. To do so, we will create an asset class that directly invests in nature conservation and sustainable land use while contributing to climate change adaptation and mitigation. Our idea is to try and optimize risk return through bankable solutions that generate a return while at the same time protecting and restoring nature. We're aware that this is not easy, but we know that it's possible. So how do we want to do this specifically? What kind of projects do we want to invest in that can do what I just described? Our portfolio builds on three main pillars, and I'd like to take a minute to just explain a little bit more concretely what they look like. The majority, more than 70% of our funds, will invest in high quality and ecologically certified agricultural and forest products. For example, sustainable coffee, cocoa, and other commodities that see a strong national and international market demand. To give you just one example of the market potential, in 2017, exported cocoa beans represented a combined value of more than $8 billion, and the global cocoa beans market is expected to grow by more than 7% annually to 2025, mostly due to strong demand of chocolate. Within the sector, sustainably produced cocoa is expected to grow even faster than conventionally produced cocoa. In 2017, we had an estimated 22% of globally traded cocoa, which was sustainability certified. This represents as much as a 10-fold increase from about 2% 10 years before. This is just to give you a sense of the strong growth potential and revenue potential for these types of products. Now, how does this benefit forests? Sustainable cocoa production systems, for example, by mixing forest and cocoa trees and by applying regenerative farming techniques, can help farmers stabilize their yields through the existing land, as opposed to depleting soil fertility, which would then force them to shift and cut further into new tropical forests in regular intervals. Farming systems that mix trees with cocoa can also help farmers diversify their sources of income, provide ecosystem services, and support plant and animal biodiversity. So that's the first pillar of our investment strategy. Secondly, we'll invest into plant-based food products with a low carbon footprint. These will include innovative alternative proteins that are based on plants. Some of them you might find in your local supermarkets. The great thing about them is that they require only a fraction of the space, of the energy and the water that conventional proteins need that are based on meat. To give you, again, just one example, we've recently signed an expression of interest with a company that produces a vegan protein. Compared to the production of beef, making this protein emits 96% less CO2. The global plant-based meat market, which is already estimated at more than 13 billion USD in 2020, is expected to reach as much as 35 billion US dollar by 2027. So here as well, we see not only an opportunity for the climate, but also a huge market opportunity. And then last but not least, we'll invest into rewilding businesses and ecosystem restoration. Why is this? Because we all know that as much as we need to reduce deforestation, today, many natural ecosystems are already degraded. And these need to be restored urgently. So the business models around these are based on ecotourism, on restorative agriculture, among others. And in addition, these investments will generate carbon credits and other payments for ecosystem services to monetize the climate benefits and increase the returns on our investments. We target a fund size of 80 million euros, and to find the best companies and initiatives with the highest impact and low risk that we can invest in, we'll operate in various geographies, including Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Europe. In terms of the target impacts, we know that conserving and restoring forests is the most cost-effective option that the global community has at its disposal to mitigate climate change. So we're convinced that there will be significant climate benefits. Our target impacts include more than 20 million tons of CO2 equivalent avoided, 120,000 hectares of forest conserved or restored, and increased resilience to climate change for more than 100,000 households worldwide. What does this mean in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Well, we believe that this is where you can see how powerful, well-designed nature-based solutions can be. First and foremost, we'll concentrate on generating impacts on SDG 13, that's climate action, SDG 15, life on land, and SDG 1, reducing poverty. We'll track indicators related to each of these in order to measure how our fund performs over time. But beyond these, we'll also track the performance of our investments related to several other co-benefits, such as gender equality, very important, health, and decent work. To give you a few more examples of our investment portfolio, to maximize impact and reduce risks, we'll diversify thematically and geographically. For example, with sustainably produced coffee in Brazil, green cocoa and ecotourism in Costa Rica, rewilding monoculture plantations in Portugal by moving from monoculture agriculture to more diverse agroforestry, and substituting beef-based proteins in Sweden, for example. Luckily, we already have an active deal flow with 7 target companies that already signed an expression of interest with us. To help us identify and structure investment opportunities in different regions, a team is based in several continents, with portfolio developments in different locations, and a team has more than 10 years of experience on average in sustainable land use and sustainable finance across the globe. Having said that, we're conscious that the task at hand is significant. So to increase our reach, we leverage our networks with UNDP, with other UN teams, and with international NGOs on site to advance the work in different regions. To give you, again, just one example, we recently became a strategic partner of the UN Development Programme's Climate Innovation Accelerator, alongside the EU, the Adaptation Fund, and UNEP. So if you'd like to know more about investment strategy and our fund, please do get in touch with us. Once again, the stakes for ecosystem restoration couldn't possibly be higher today. So join forces with us and let's make this decade a success. Thanks again, looking forward to exchanging and working together.
Excellent, thank you, Alexander. If there's no other questions for Alexander, we would like to move on. Oh, we have one over there. They're coming.
Thank you very much. My name is Thorsten Klimpel. I work for Orverde. I saw that you put the word blended finance. So I would like to know what do you think would be the proportion you need with public fund to leverage a private fund? Maybe you have some experience in this. For how many years do you think you need this blended of finance to leverage a private capital? Is it always like this, or maybe it's a scenario to just have this investment case with only private capital? Do you invest as well in smallholders? That's my last question.
Yeah, thank you very much. A number of points there. I'll try to be really brief in the interest of time. Yes, this market is relatively new and innovative. So it's very important to work together and partner with public institutions, multilaterals, and others who can come in with these so-called blended finance solutions. The idea is, depending on the transactions, that a climate or development-oriented funding mechanisms would de-risk a part of our investments, for example, by taking first loss positions. And we have a lot of experience in working with the Green Climate Fund and other organizations and funding mechanisms to structure these kinds of investments. We think that once the market matures and funds such as ours hopefully make the case that there is a successful business model here, these types of partnerships, public-private, blended finance, might be less necessary than they are today. And also in our portfolio, there will definitely be a whole range of investments that do not require this kind of blended finance structure. But this will mature over time and over the years. And so we think that there's a gradual shift towards more and more commercial solutions in this sector. In a way, we see this, therefore, as a bridging mechanism, but we very much welcome the partnerships and the interest by multilaterals, regional development banks, and international climate finance mechanisms to come in and collaborate on this interesting market. In terms of smallholder farmers, the point you raised, absolutely, that's really important. And we'd like to make sure that especially those communities in developing countries that produce a lot of the commodities and depend on healthy ecosystems are at front and center when it comes to developing these investment proposals. So working with integrating, actively engaging local communities and smallholder farming communities into our projects and transactions is very much at the core of our investment strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Very inspiring. And I think we will have to move on to our next presenter. So thank you very much. And I'd like to present and welcome Juan Carlos Pereira, the founder and managing partner of Add Value Management. Their Small Farmers Climate Adaptation Fund aims to provide climate adaptation solutions to smallholder farms in Latin America. Welcome, Juan Carlos.
Thank you so much, Stefan. My name is Juan Carlos Pereira. I'm one of the partners at Add Value Management. We are based in San Jose, Costa Rica, and we work through all the Latin American region. I'm going to share my screen here with the presentation. Okay. There you go. Okay. Add Value Management is the company behind the structuring of the Small Farmers Climate Adaptation Fund. It's a fund that is focused on providing climate adaptation solutions to smallholder farmers. The small farmers in our region and in the rest of the world are already suffering from several factors such as low productivity, poverty, youth migration, lack of financing, limited access to technology. And with the climate change, some of these factors are intensifying, and they are also suffering from other effects of climate change, such as dry spells, soil erosion, torrential rains, pests, and diseases. To give you some idea of how important are smallholder farmers in the world, according to the Food and Agricultural Administration, there are the food production for the world will need to increase 60% by 2050 to feed over 9.5 billion people. On the other hand, we have that 70% of the world food production comes from smallholder farmers. So there's, it's obvious that they will need all the support they could get to reach those production levels. On the funding or financial side, there is also a huge financial gap from the funds flowing to small farmers. It is estimated that around $12.5 billion are not getting to the small farmer sector only in Latin America per year. Fortunately, there are several smart agricultural techniques that could make climate adaptation feasible for small farmers. Most of these techniques require relatively small investments from farmers. However, the limited financial and technological conditions in which most small farmers operate prevent them from accessing these techniques. The countries, the group of countries that we have selected for the fund to work are 8 countries in Latin America where the fund will be delivering its services. And those countries are Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Peru. It is estimated that 6 million small farmers live in those countries. Small farmers, you are using the criteria that small farmers are farmers that work in lands of 5 hectares or less. We have developed a theory of change for the fund, and basically says that through climate smart agriculture adaptation measures delivered by rural financial organizations that combine financial support and technical assistance, small farmers can effectively build more resilient and sustainable farms to protect themselves from climate change, and at the same time improve their livelihoods. This is how our theory of change looks like. We have a series of inputs going from financing, the adaptation measures, technical assistance, and technology, and a series of activities that we will be delivering with the TA facility, and also responsible for some of these activities are the microfinance institutions that will be working with us. And the combination of these inputs and activities are expected to deliver a series of outputs and outcomes that will help achieve the long-term goals of the project, which are basically more resilient farms to climate change and better livelihoods for the small farmers. The fund is a 30 million fund lending facility plus a 2.1 technical assistance facility. The fund will be closed-end with a total life of 10 years. And the investment vehicle we have selected are medium-term loans through approximately 15 rural microfinance institutions in the 8 countries that I mentioned before. The target market are 20,000 small farmers in need of climate adaptation measures. It's a triple bottom line project that involves first to improve socioeconomic conditions of rural populations. Second, provides positive returns to investors. And third, helps build climate resilience and improve environmental conditions. As I mentioned before, the fund will have a TA facility that supports participating MFIs to develop capabilities to better assess small farmer clients' climate vulnerabilities and threats, train smallholder farmers, develop financial products that include climate adaptation measures, adopt methodologies to deliver and monitor the implementation of climate adaptation solutions, and incorporate impact metrics and measuring methodologies. We have been recognized, awarded by the Climate Finance Accelerator in Luxembourg, and we are part of the Spring 2019 cohort. We have also built a strong strategic alliance with the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CIAT, and the CGR's research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. And as part of this partnership, we conducted the SMAF's feasibility study and the science-based technical framework, including the selection of climate adaptation practices, cost-benefit analysis, and design of impact metrics and measuring procedures. The fund, besides the 2 main long-term goals, which are to increase the livelihoods or to improve the livelihoods of small farmers and to increase resilience to climate change, has other impact pillars, such as to work with indigenous communities, to foster gender equality, to improve food security for these communities, and to help prevent climate migration. The fund, the investment strategy of the fund is relatively simple. We have Add Value, which is the management company, and will be responsible for managing both the SMAF lending window and the TA facility. These 2 windows will be working with microfinance institutions in the 8 countries that we have selected. The SMAF lending window providing medium-term loans, and the technical facility providing technical support to the MFIs. At the same time, the MFIs are expected to provide financial bundles, training, and adaptation measures to the smallholder farmers that will participate in the project. Together with CIAT and CGR, we worked on the technical framework for the project, and we applied the methodology that is briefly described here. We went and worked with a sample of 50 small farmers in 4 countries of Central America and Ecuador. And those 50 small farmers are clients of 4 microfinance institutions that have been working with us also in the project. The methodology started with an analysis of the main climate threats being faced by these small farmers. Then we went to assess the potential negative effects of these threats on productivity, income, and of the crops and animals that those small farmers are working on. And then we assessed the climate vulnerability of the different agricultural systems. Then we took a series of adaptation measures that are readily available right now, and we prioritized a total of 16 that we felt that dealt well with the threats and vulnerabilities that we have identified in this sample of small farmers. And then we went to work on the potential positive effects of these 16 adaptation measures on the productivity, income, crop losses, and the other outcomes and outputs that we identified at the analysis stage. We came up with, as I said, with a list of 16 adaptation measures that are basically classified in two groups. First are those that involve change in methods, agricultural methods, and some examples are integrated pest management, crop diversification, and natural shade. The other group are those that require building infrastructure and installing equipment as well. And we have a few examples here. For example, drip irrigation, rainwater reservoirs, and greenhouses. In terms of the impacts, as you can see here, we developed a total of 16 outputs and outcomes that we later classified as targets. Those are the basic targets in the fund that will take us to the long-term goals. And basically, those 16 targets are classified in those that improved the livelihood of small farmers. Then we have a second group, those that increase resilience and improve sustainability of farms. And then we have a third group that deals with both. I mean, it has contributions to livelihoods and also to resilience. And we link them to the development sustainable goals. As you can see here, there are 7 of the sustainable development goals that we are tackling to the project. And this is an example of the methodology that we used with CIAT and CGIAR in analyzing each one of the adaptation measures that we selected and how effective they were in dealing with the different threats that we identified at the field level with the sample of small farmers. Those threats are basically diseases, droughts, fires, frosts, hailstorm, heat waves, irregular rains, landslides, pests, and strong winds. And then we went to analyze how these adaptation measures, each one of them, were not only helping protect the small farmers against those threats, but also the effects that they will have on the outcomes and the outputs for the theory of change, and ultimately their contribution to the two main long-term goals of the project, which are increased livelihoods and increased resilience to climate change. So maybe I stop here. Thank you so much, and see if you have any questions about the project.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Unfortunately, we won't have much time for questions for you. So thank you very much for your presentation. And with this, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Ian Henderson, who's the Managing Director for ADM Capital Climate, which is a blended finance impact fund focused on sustainable agricultural commodities in Indonesia.
Thanks very much, Stefan, and good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to talk about the Capital Asia Climate Landscape Fund, or ACLF, which is a new fund from ADM Capital. In a nutshell, it's going to provide bespoke lending solutions to Indonesian enterprises that are taking advantage of opportunities in the food and agriculture sector. LEF has been designed to harness the two core strengths of ADM Capital across finance and sustainability. In terms of investment strategies, we've been providing finance across the Pacific since 1998. Always had a strong focus on borrowers that can't access traditional bank finance, and we'll talk more about that later. We've also recently launched a sustainable global food and ag strategy in 2016. On the sustainability side, sustainability has been in our DNA for many, many years. We set up a foundation, ADM Capital Foundation, in 2006, and we were the first PR tree outside of Japan, Asia Pacific region, back in 2008. And that actually makes us a pretty rare beast in the Asian investment management world. Moving on to the fund, as you can see from the text in bold, the ACLF will provide finance to enterprises working in sustainable agroforestry and aquaculture. And you can also see at them, it's evident because we're huge fans of IFCA. The Asian Climate Smart Landscape Fund was an idea several years ago. We were lucky enough to be given a special award as an existing fund manager, but this was our first pure play climate strategy. And perhaps just to talk a little bit about the ADM Capital Group, but link it to the last point. What's really exciting about this fund is the box in the top right-hand corner here, which is ADM Capital Climate. So this fund is actually catalyzing a new vertical, which will be climate-focused credit across the ADM Capital Group. And this builds on the two investment strategies, which are the left-hand boxes, and also the knowledge and networks of our foundation, which I touched on earlier. We've obviously been running money for a couple of decades, and we've had a pretty extensive number of years looking at sustainability across the region. But I think what really sets us apart is a focus on partnerships, and these are key to the ACLF, both at fund level and at asset level. On the left-hand side of this screen, you'll see that we're in discussions with the Development Finance Corporation of the USA, and this is to provide a partial guarantee at the fund level. We've had a letter of interest, so we're hopeful that that conversation will firm up. And on the right-hand side, we're also looking to partner with an independent third party. The idea here is that this organization will come in and chair and manage an impact advisory board. So really hold the impact standards high. And I think it's also an interesting observation that I think a lot of our financial incentives at the moment are destined to be linked to the delivery of that impact. Building on this partnership theme, there's some text along the bottom which refers to the TLFF, the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility. This is actually a platform for mobilizing finance across the land use and also the clean energy space. We were part of, and we'll talk about that later. I think it's also important to note that at the asset level, at the transaction level, every single one of our transactions will involve a local NGO partner. At fund level, we've got three core metrics, which you can see on the screen. So if you don't have access to a screen, it's a greenhouse gas target, a jobs target, and a land use target. And I think in the center of the screen, an important point to note is that 30% of the jobs we hope to create will be for women. And actually, beyond that, 30% of the borrowers in the fund will be eligible for the 2x gender challenge. You can see some of the threshold criteria at the bottom center of the screen. I mentioned earlier we've got a global food and ag private equity strategy, which is run out of London, and a core part of that focuses on ag tech. So we're hoping to use technology as an enabler. We won't be investing directly in ag tech companies, but we hope to harness it for a range of reasons, and some of those are depicted on this slide. So we anticipate them bringing down cost curves. We anticipate them helping us to build out our traceability capabilities and also to deliver impact. If we take a step back and perhaps go back to the start, the idea behind the ACLF was actually to provide a solution to a structural issue that we and several other like-minded organizations had observed in the region for a number of years. And this is that many of the more sustainable activities that lead to outcomes in this space require medium to long-term funding that generally isn't available. And this is for several reasons. So one is that the jurisdictions in this part of the world, Indonesia in particular, or many of them are dominated by banks. And these banks fund themselves largely through deposits rather than issuing bonds on the capital markets. And this creates a bias to shorter term lending. A second is that we're moving to a new normal in agriculture. In the old days, if you wanted to expand agriculturally, it was probably legitimate and legal and the done thing to, for example, chop down the nearest forest, sell that timber, and use the cash that you generate on day one to offset some of your financing needs and bring in the tenor of the financing you require. Absent that, if you're trying to break the cycle of substituting natural capital for financial capital, in many cases, you actually need to borrow slightly more money and you need to borrow money for slightly longer terms. So the ACLF was set up to support enterprises whose lending needs are sometimes too long for the domestic players for reasons I've already touched on, but who arguably are a bit too small to make sense given the unit economics of some of the larger international financiers that can lend over these longer tenors. So we're looking at 3 to 5 year plus loans and probably a $5 to $20 million bite size. In terms of our experience in landscape finance, I've already talked about the left-hand side of this slide. Both the foundation and the investment management arm were very acutely aware of this barrier, the need for longer-term finance and the lack of the financial system's structural ability to deliver it. This led to the development of the TLFF in 2016. So ADM Capital, along with BNP Paribas, ECRAF and UNEP, launched it in 2016 with support of the government of Indonesia. And the first transaction was in 2018. So there's a lot of text on this slide, but in a nutshell, a $95 million bond was issued off the TLFF platform for a rubber company that was looking to develop 2 concessions across 2 different provinces in Indonesia, spanning about 90,000 hectares. For anyone who's familiar with Singapore, that's roughly about the same size. There's a case study on the Convergence website if anyone's interested in understanding a bit more about the deal specifics. But we've talked about blended finance already in this session, and maybe just to highlight that there were several blended finance instruments involved in this transaction. One was actually a design grant from Convergence to really help us understand how we would assemble the capital stack, but also the stakeholder stack, which, as we'll touch on in a later slide, we feel is absolutely fundamental to the success of these kind of transactions. There was also a guarantee that USAID gave to the senior tranche of the bond. And what this did was it allowed more institutional type investors who wouldn't probably consider a sustainable rubber project in Indonesia to provide finance. We also had several grants which directly led to some of the impact on the slide that will follow. Very roughly, in terms of the project, of the 90,000 hectares, roughly a third was used for productive purposes, planting out sustainable rubber. Roughly a third was set aside for conservation, either because it was high carbon or high conservation value land. And about a third of the land was used for community projects. There's roughly 50,000 people living within the concession boundaries, which makes the role of communities and making sure that the company gets that right of huge importance. I'm not going to go into all the individual impacts here. I think they speak for themselves. But I think they highlight what can be done with the right sort of capital and the right sort of partners. Looking more holistically as the TLFF, I think it really helped us validate the need for the ACLF and also the investment strategy of the ACLF. Maybe if we pick on a couple of observations, it made it very clear that the right kind of capital was a material barrier for enterprises looking to move towards more sustainable business models for reasons we've already touched on. As I've mentioned already, it made it very clear that it's not just the right capital stack that is important, but also the right partnership stack, the right partnership configuration. And I think what it did for us was make it very clear that although it's a challenging space to work in at times, the food and agriculture sector is likely to be a rapidly growing area for investors this decade, much like the clean energy and clean mobility sector was for investors last decade. To wrap up, in terms of our journey, we hope we'll get to first close in Q2 next year and start getting money on the ground. And I hope we can come back to a future GLF and give you an update on our experiences and what we've learned so far. I think with that, I'll stop and hand back to Stefan. Very happy to answer any questions, and if anyone would like to reach out, very happy to connect via LinkedIn. Thank you for your time.
Excellent, Ian. Thank you so much. We have some time for a question, if anybody's keen. The gentleman over there.
Yeah, thanks. That all looks really good. I only had one note on that very last slide that you put up, not to criticize your work. 11 million rubber tree plants and only 4,000 native species. Could you talk to maybe a little bit how you could increase your planting rate of native species, increasing the biodiversity, because they're effectively just doing monoculture, and we love to give more money to the farmers to make them more, incentivize them, but how can we help them be better actors overall? Sorry.
No, it's fine, but I'm actually the wrong person to speak to about that. So can I ask your name and where you're from, and I'll connect you with someone that can answer that question. I'm not actually directly involved with the ROU transaction. So if you've still got the mic, if you either drop me an email.
I'll drop you an email. That's the easiest way.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
that works best.
Sorry, it's not a cop-out. Yeah.
We're happy to give you Ian's details as well if you didn't get a picture of it.
Yeah, sorry, I should have put them on the slide.
All right, Ian, thank you so much. So then we're moving on to our final speaker now. Last but definitely not least, Dr. Ayesha Khan, who's the country director of Acumen Pakistan. They're launching a fund, Parsaf, the first climate fund in Pakistan. They aim to increase adaptation capacity for smallholder farmers in Pakistan itself. Ayesha?
Thanks, Stefan, and thanks everyone for being here. So we started off by talking about the most vulnerable. And Juan Carlos talked about smallholder farmers, and we've been talking about how do we best focus on serving the needs of those who are most hit by climate change. Here, before I talk about what our fund is doing, which is, again, as you can see from the name, focused on building the climate resilience of the most vulnerable, I do want to take a moment to talk about who these vulnerable people actually are. Risham, if you could move. And what they're struggling with, because often our conversations end up getting really theoretical. So I'm going to talk in numbers, and I'll throw a few numbers at you. If you want to be calculating exchange rates, right now the PKR is between 165 to 170 rupees to the dollar, but I will come back to the dollar equivalent. If you look at smallholder farmers, and again, there are 500 million of those around the world who are feeding billions of people around. Most of them are women, by the way. I'm going to step into Sindh, where you do have millions of smallholder farmers, and the land that they're cultivating on is roughly 1 to 2 acres. If you look at that land, there's only one real crop that they grow every season. So it's not as though you can have repeated cultivations, because again, due to floods, there's only one growing season. So as they're growing them, most of these farmers are working on sharecrop land, which means the land is actually owned by a large landowner. They are getting the inputs through the landowner, who actually pays for half the cost of the input, and then the output is actually split in half as well. So if you go back, most of these farmers are producing staple crops like wheat, and on 1 or 2 acres, they end up spending about 70,000 rupees to actually cultivate. Most of this is fertilizer, some of it is seed. And as you can imagine, this is not the best quality of seed. You get poor quality seed, you get poor quality inputs. Everyone's trying to save money. The landlord doesn't want to put much upfront. However, there is a cost of actually providing that. When the harvest comes, and let's make an assumption that there was no massive pest infestation or crazy weather, let's assume the harvest actually comes in. Productivity levels are so low, again, because of the low quality inputs, that on 1 acre of land, you'll produce about 30 mounds of wheat. Now, this is maybe half to a third of what other regions produce. The price of wheat is set in the local market, and that's about 1,700-1,800 rupees. They end up making about 59,100 rupees for the entire year, which is, by the way, roughly equivalent to $363. You subtract the cost of the inputs, and per acre, you're left with roughly $140 for the entire year. If you have 2 acres, you can double that. That comes out to be about $23 a month for a smallholder family. And this is a family of roughly 9 to 10 people, in which it's mostly the women who are going out and cultivating. They come back, it's backbreaking labor. There are no savings. And so when I say it's less than $1 a day, it's not that they're selling this wheat in the market. This wheat is actually there for them to feed and eat off. So there aren't any savings. Livestock is what is used in order to kind of accommodate for any emergency cash needs, any healthcare issues. So when we go into why is it that farmers actually aren't adopting technology, what is it that they're doing, you don't have much flexibility with less than $1 a day to do much. So let's keep that front and center, and then talk about what is it that we need to actually do in order to solve for this. If we then pick that up and extrapolate that to a larger scale, the region that our fund is focused on, we can go to the next slide, Risha, which is Pakistan. Again, Pakistan has 240 million people. It is the 5th most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. And I know in COP, we've been talking a lot about the disproportionality of those who pollute and those who suffer. So Pakistan emits less than 1% of all GHG emissions. However, it is the 5th most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. And it doesn't help that geographically, Pakistan is surrounded by China and India, which are 2 of the largest emitters in the world right now. And what that means is that when world temperatures go up by 1 degree Celsius, Pakistan actually has 1.6 degrees Celsius of a change overall over the next century or so. In terms of agriculture and overall outcomes, this has a devastating impact overall, because again, in this country, 2 out of 3 people are in rural areas and dependent on agriculture entirely for their livelihood. This is the core of the economy, and this is quite similar to many other emerging regions. But climate change means that the smallholder farmers that we talked about earlier, who are already on $1 a day, are far more vulnerable. And what we're seeing is, because of the changes happening over the past 10 years, Pakistan has gone from a country that actually exported food to a country where 90 million people are actually food insecure. We're importing food. 40% of the children are born stunted. And we're losing about $1 billion a year due to flood damages and the fact that they actually just aren't able to manage this. So what do we do? How do we solve for this? This is where our fund comes in. We'll just get to that. This is where ParkF comes in. And what we're doing with this fund is, it is the first climate change fund in Pakistan. And as the local, Risham, you can move to the next one. As the local investment landscape continues to gain traction, this is a fund that takes an $80 million facility to make early and growth stage investments in agri-tech and agro businesses. And our investments through, and it's important to note that this is equity and quasi-equity instruments, which includes some self-liquidating and mezzanine debt type instruments. The ticket size is about $500,000 to $3 million. And we will focus entirely on innovative business models across the value chain that enable farmers to anticipate, manage, and bounce back from climate events so that they're more resilient to climate shifts around them. And also, again, figuring out, are there alternate sources of income that we can use to support the farmers through this kind of crazy volatility that they go through. The sector needs patient capital. We've talked about this. PARCAF is also a blended finance instrument in which we have a 50% first loss layer in order to be able to attract more commercial capital. The amount of capital needed, frankly, for these companies to grow is significant. $90 million, which includes a $10 million technical assistance facility, is just about enough to be able to support 20 or so companies through the life of the fund. And, again, as we look into what this fund will be focused on, we're looking at three main areas. One, since the entire value chain is fairly broken, very similar to other regions that suffer from this, we will look at innovative agro-businesses that are actually building up the value chain itself. We're looking at this really interesting piece of new businesses that are coming up, which leverage ICT and artificial intelligence to really figure out how do we actually optimize along each of these value chain components. And again, finally, we're also going to be looking at efficient energy enablers, because in addition to all the other shortages across the value chain, there's also a massive shortage of energy. Forget clean energy, there just isn't any. Farmers are actually using very old mechanized ways of farming their land. So we'll also be looking at this third vector, which also has a mitigation component. And so while it seems like, that massive challenges across the board, what's happening is that there are also some really amazing solutions that are beginning to emerge. These are local, innovative ideas. Some of them are building from ideas that have worked in other regions around the world. And we're looking at entrepreneurs trying to solve for really critical issues with innovative, powerful, and catalytic models across the value chain. We'll be investing in these. There are a couple that, again, focus entirely on B2B models of how do you create the right input match for, let's say, farmers who are actually figuring out what to plant, when to plant, how do you get the right information? And there are many others, and I'll be happy to talk about them subsequently as well. In terms of impact, PARCAF is, I mentioned already, it's the first climate fund in a very vulnerable region. It's an adaptation-focused fund. Again, adaptation still gets only a fifth of total funding, and most of this funding is through debt, which further burdens developing countries. This is not a debt burden. Finally, thirdly, there's a critical gender nexus with climate change, because 80% of ag labor force is female. And so as we keep building up on this, we're actually going to have an impact on how gender equity works. And Pakistan is the second most gender unequal country in the world. So really being able to shift that would be huge. And finally, in an emerging market, to be de-risking new sectors. At the core of this are food systems. I mean, do need to build those up. This fund will be actually building up on those as well. Finally, how are we going to do it? Again, it's not the simplest challenge to solve for, otherwise someone would have solved for it already. But as Acumen, we've been doing this for 2 decades already. We've been investing patient capital to solve some of the hardest problems facing the poor around the world. We've invested early stage capital in 139 companies in 15 countries across 6 regions. In Pakistan itself, Acumen has been on the ground. We're the oldest investor, really, and we have a team that really knows the market very well. We have been making investments in life-changing products and services focused on the most vulnerable. So we keep saying that disrupting the world's most pervasive problems is in our DNA. And we're really excited about taking our new fund forward. We're expecting a first close towards the middle of next year. We've had great conversations with LPs across both layers, the junior and the senior. And, again, I am so happy to hear about all the work that's happening. At the end of the day, we all need to work together to find solutions that keep the most vulnerable, to keep the farmers at the center of what we're doing. PARCAF is a start in that direction. And we hope it sets the blueprint for many more funds like this. We need them all. So I do encourage you to reach out to myself or anyone on the Acumen team if you have any questions on our fund or just want to talk about adaptation or climate change. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayesha. As you said, if anybody has any questions to her, please let us know and we'll put you in touch with Ayesha and her team. We'll be moving on pretty quickly now. The next plenary is going to start in a few more minutes or so. So we hope that our initiative and the fund managers that you've seen today speak give you an insight into how blended finance actually takes shape in the right ways and how we can actually translate all these very good initiatives and all these different discussions and funnel all that, the capital and the pledges to the beneficiaries on the ground. Now, just as a final bit, thank you very much for having us. A big thank you, obviously, to our host, the Global Landscape Forum, for making this enable us to be here. And last but not least, obviously, thank you so much to our speakers who took the time to actually present and share all these insights with you. Thank you, guys.